Alrighty, welcome everyone to another exciting edition of American Studies 201, and welcome to the second lecture now in our third time period and theme, Modern American Consumer Culture. In our first lecture in this third time period and theme, we examined the origins of modern American consumer culture. We talked about some trends in the late 19th, early 20th century, in the Gilded Age, and the Progressive Era that helped demonstrate why a consumer economy and with a consumer culture developed for the first time in that period. We concluded our look at the Progressive Era in the latter stage of that lecture by talking about how, for a number of reasons, Fordism, changes in the industrial economy, the regulation of the economy by the federal government, that by the end of the Progressive Era, Americans tended to think of progress, the great goal of the Progressive Era, as one defined by consumerism. They came to embrace consumerism, and with it, consumerism came to define the good life and progress in that progressive era. Here today in our second lecture, we're going to zoom ahead in time to the next decade in American history, the decade that follows the progressive era, the 1920s, and talk about how this is a very key decade in further expanding consumerism and with it a consumer culture. The Progressive Era was in many ways driven by a suspicion about big business. Big business was seen as exploitative, rapacious. It was driven by a great discontent in the nation as Americans became outraged by the excesses of the new industrial age and the great disparity in wealth that existed between a few who were very rich and the many who were desperately poor. So the Progressive Era, like the antebellum reform era we examined before the midterm, was a time of reform efforts that stemmed from a sense of discontent in America. And a great deal of that discontent was to be found in a suspicion about big business and inclination among progressive-minded people that big business is a threat to the good life, that it is ultimately exploitative. And that's what led to things like regulation of big business in the progressive era. 1920s, rather than that suspicion of big business, rather than see corporate America as potentially exploitative, instead, Americans came to embrace big business and see the interests of American workers and the interest of American consumers in league with, in solidarity with big business. Overall, the 1920s, as we'll talk about, was a time in which Americans were encouraged to see what's good for big business is good for us all. Now, part of this stemmed from a sense of fatigue in the 1920s. The first 2 decades of the 20th century were really tumultuous. You had the Progressive Era and all the reforms that came with it. You had World War I, and World War I was a convulsive event that really shook up American society. You had a rising feminist movement, and in 1920, the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted to at least white women the right to vote. You had the Great Migration, this massive exodus of African Americans out of the South to northern cities, which led to race riots all over the country. So the first 2 decades of the 20th century, whether you looked within the United States in the Progressive Era, America's new role around the globe as we became an empire and fought in World War I, whether you look to the social and cultural changes of this period, it was a time of remarkable change. And at the end of the Progressive Era, many Americans felt overwhelmed, fatigued by those changes. Other Americans were disillusioned by what was seen to be the failings of the Progressive Era. At the end of the Progressive Era, not all the problems in American society had been solved. At the end of the Progressive Era, there was still crime, poverty, a great disparity in wealth, and many people, therefore, felt disillusioned with the hope and promise of the Progressive Era. So there's reasons why consumerism becomes such a source of meaning in the 1920s for Americans who often felt disillusioned, despondent, were cynical or critical of the efforts of the Progressive Era. As we'll talk about in this lecture, one new source of meaning for most Americans in this period, gadgets, gizmos, wonders, delights. And that's another reason why the 1920s is such a period of, again, a sense of solidarity with big business and an embrace of consumerism. In 1920, Warren G. Harding ran for president. And he ran with a very simple term, a very simple word that he coined, in fact, to appeal to Americans who felt the sense of despondency or disillusionment or simple fatigue with the tumult and changes and often failures of the Progressive Era in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. When Warren G. Harding ran for president in 1920, he said, "Elect me and I'll return us to normalcy." He was a candidate who billed himself as the return to normalcy, the return to the way things were before, all the tumult and changes that came with the Progressive Era, America's entrance into World War I, the rather convulsive effects of the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Americans craved normalcy. They craved regularity. They craved consistency after all of these remarkable changes. And so Warren G. Harding, the original Warren G., although he wasn't much of a regulator, this Warren G. had a very appealing message, the message of normalcy that appealed to Americans in this period after the tumult and changes of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and Harding won as a result with that very appealing message, and he became the first of a series of Republican presidents in the 1920s that really represents the shift away from progressive era sensibilities that tended to embrace regulation of big business and a suspicion about the power of corporate America, a shift away from that to the sensibilities that prevail in this decade, because Warren G. Harding and the Republican presidents that followed him, Calvin Coolidge and then finally Herbert Hoover, a succession of Republican presidents in the 1920s, embraced the mantra of industrial freedom. The idea here was the regulations of the progressive era, many of which we talked about in our previous lecture, that were designed to regulate the consumer economy, make it more reliable, more legible, had gone too far. And what we needed was to deregulate big business, lower taxes, particularly on the wealthy. One of the other developments in the progressive era was a constitutional amendment that established an income tax for the first time. And so you had an income tax for the first time, and it largely targeted wealthy people. That was part of the progressive era and its more regulatory interventionist role for the federal government. But under Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, there's this idea that, well, we're taxing rich people too much, and we need to deregulate, we need to lower taxes. And what that will do, this mantra, this plan, this program of industrial freedom, is free the businessmen from onerous regulations. Having more money in their pockets through lowering their taxes will mean they'll invest more, and the economy will grow, and more Americans can enjoy a good life defined by consumerism. So rather than the regulatory approach to the consumer economy that prevailed in the 1920s, in the progressive era rather, in the 1920s, industrial freedom would be widely embraced, not just by the Republican presidents that preside in this period, but the American people who became convinced that what's good for big business is good for us all. And they became convinced of that because of the expanded and changing consumer meanings in this period that folded more people into the consumer experience, provided more gadgets, gizmos, and pleasures, and overall led to a sense of the good life in the 1920s defined by consumerism. So Americans who were craving normalcy, Americans who felt disillusioned, despondent by the failures, perceived failures of the progressive era, as America still had problems like poverty, crime, illiteracy, Americans who felt overwhelmed by the remarkable social and cultural changes of the first 2 decades of the 20th century could find meaning, pleasure, normalcy in consumerism. And as a result, they became convinced that what's good for big business is good for us. Let's support this idea of industrial freedom. And so the 1920s represents politically a pivot away from the progressive era, but with this pivot, a further embrace of meaning, identity, all the things that we're interested at this point in the class in regards to consumer culture, those meanings, those identities connected to things. One of the reasons why Americans came to see big business as this handmaiden of the good life, one of the reasons why Americans came to embrace this mantra of industrial morality was simply the booming, roaring economy of the 1920s. Europe had been decimated by World War I, where the war itself had been fought. Millions had died. And so America really benefited from the ravages, deprivations that World War I wrought on the populations, infrastructures, and economies of Europe. And filling that void, filling that vacuum on the global industrial market was the United States. And so American factories had roared into production during World War I, mass producing bombs, bullets, and boots to sell to the nations at war. And then after World War I, America continued to benefit from that catastrophe that ravaged so much of Europe. So it was a booming time for the American economy. And that seemed to validate the idea of industrial freedom. That seemed to validate the idea that if you lower taxes, deregulate big business, well, a booming economy will result. Also in the 1920s, there were changes in industrialism, changes in the industrial economy that led to greater productivity, greater efficiency of production. We mentioned earlier innovations like the assembly line used by Henry Ford to mass produce automobiles in a much more efficient way. Also, there were changes in industrial worker management, where breaks became more common in industrial labor, where you'd get a 10-minute break, a coffee break, a cigarette break. And that meant, of course, you were off the assembly line for 10 minutes, not working. But studies show that workers would come back with greater energy after taking a 10-minute break and actually work more, be more productive over the course of a 10 or 12-hour workday. So breaks are good because they revitalize, re-energize your workers. Windows were installed in factories in the 1920s because studies show that when natural light enters a building, it makes workers feel better. Less doomy, less gloomy, and as a result, they work harder. So simple innovations like that, along with things like the assembly line, led to greater productivity, greater efficiency in the industrial workplace, and that meant you could mass produce goods cheaper, more efficiently, and sell them at a cheaper price. And so you had a booming economy, you had productivity gains, you had lower commodity prices as a result, and that meant that consumer goods were increasingly available even to poor and working class Americans. Also, there were new things. As we've seen and talked about earlier, as we'll continue to talk about in lectures to come, consumerism really depends on novelty, new things coming about that seem to satisfy our urge for new novelty, for something exciting. And you had new things that seemed to indicate a brave new world ahead for us in the 1920s. What began as an experimentation with flight now led to an aviation industry and the production of airplanes, which was a key part of a booming economy in places like Southern California and the efforts of people like Howard Hughes. New innovations in chemicals and synthetic materials that made goods more dependable, more reliable. New electronics like things like radio and the phonograph that provided entertainment inside the home. So there were new things that made people again really embrace the prospects of a new economy, a rebounding economy, a strong economy, and consumer goods that were increasingly available. So again, into that context of greater disillusionment, despondency, World War I took the lives of over 100,000 American soldiers. You may be aware, based on contemporary events, that there was a massive epidemic in the late 1910s and into the early 1920s, a massive flu epidemic that took the lives of millions of people around the globe. But into that sense of despair and misery that followed World War I and the epidemic, and again the disillusionment and despondency that came with the end of the Progressive Era, came this new hope. Hope now in the form of consumerism and a booming, roaring economy. Fordism began as a program of industrial management in automobiles, embracing high efficiency, high productivity, and higher wages, paying workers more so they could spend more. But eventually other industries beyond automobile industry embraced Fordism, food processing, like the production of white bread, household appliances, and then Ford's competitors, GM and others, said, you know what, we may have criticized Ford when he first implemented this plan, but we could see its genius, and they too embraced the idea of mass production, higher wages, and so Fordism became the rule. And as a result, workers had more money, they could buy more things, and the booming economy continued. Automobile production tripled in the 1920s. Automobiles had once been the province of the rich. Only a wealthy American could afford the freedom and liberty and opportunities that came with the automobile. But as I said in previous lecture, by the 1920s, you could buy a Model T Ford for $220. That meant that even the poorest American could now enjoy, again, the pleasures, liberties, and opportunities that came with the automobile. So this was, again, bringing the good life to the masses. This was opening new opportunities for people. The automobile represented greater mobility, freedom, a chance to engage with other consumer activities. And so this one consumer good, like ripples in a pond, had far-reaching effects that could reach Americans even if they were poor, even if they were in rural areas. By the end of the 1920s, half of all Americans owned at least one car. Some, imagine the possibilities, owned 2 cars. So it's a good example of, again, how the effects of things like Fordism brought the pleasures, liberties, and opportunities of consumerism that had once been confined to a few, to the many, and in doing so validating consumerism and the American economy as, again, engines of pleasure and the good life. The automobile had far-reaching effects. It helped to bolster other industries connected to the automobile. You may not work for Ford, but you might work in the steel industry, the rubber industry, you might build roads. So there are all sorts of contingent effects that came from the greater availability of the automobile. So this one industry fueled a broader economic expansion, and with it, more jobs, more opportunities to buy these trinkets, gadgets, and gizmos of the good life. Remember, Fordism, paying workers more, wasn't just about the effects it would have on the workers themselves, but the broader economy. Henry Ford and later his competitors realized if you pay your workers more, they've got more money to spend. They'll buy your cars or they'll spend money so that other people will buy your cars. The automobile from the very beginning represented more than just basic transportation. It represented freedom, liberty, opportunity. If you watch car ads today, in the 21st century, they're not selling a car, they're not selling a truck, they're selling this idea of freedom, to go where you want, when you want, to live the good life. Look how often you see in automobile ads people having the greatest time of their life. So the automobile, when it really began to be increasingly available here in the 1920s through today, 100 years later, is really not about the automobile. It's about pleasure, the good life, freedom. And part of that was the fact that the automobile allowed you to go places that had been previously outside your reach. It allowed you to engage in a broader consumer economy, to go to the local movie house in the 1920s, to go to a baseball game. It promoted and enabled a tourist industry to develop. You have the advent of road construction that allowed people to motor around the country, go to national parks, a new word. Enter the American vocabulary in the 1920s, never uttered before, but now necessary. That word was motel, as a whole new industry facilitating a more mobile society sprouted up. So with the automobile, you are no longer disconnected from so many of the other wonders and pleasures of the consumer marketplace. You could go to the movies, you could go to a baseball game, you could go on vacation, even in rural areas. Parts of the country that had been hitherto touched by this new consumer economy, they too were liberated by the automobile, ending that sense of isolation that came with rural life. And in the 1920s, as we'll talk about here in just a moment, you had the first wave of suburbanization, where now people could live in the suburbs and work in cities, thanks to the greater liberties, transportation possibilities that came with the automobile. And with it came a sense of the good life connected to private home ownership in the suburbs that now sprouted up around big cities thanks to the greater mobility that came with the automobile. So the automobile is really one of the key icons of American consumerism, and it certainly expanded greatly here in the 1920s, and with it you could see a great deal of contingent effects and evidence of how consumerism had these far-reaching consequences. The effects of all of this expanded economy, the booming roaring 20s, and the expansion of consumerist opportunities and expressions included changing our sense of time. This is a moment in the class where we are dedicating our focus to American consumer culture. We are in our third time period and theme, American consumer culture in the modern era. And with our focus here on consumer culture, we're talking about the identities, meanings, experiences associated with consumer goods. One of the key lessons to take away from these lectures at this point in the class is that consumerism isn't really about the goods themselves, it's about the meanings associated with those goods, like the car representing freedom, opportunity, the good life. And in the 1920s, with all of these expanded consumer activities, something that you might imagine exists beyond consumerism. Our sense of time was instead deeply influenced by consumerism. What we'll talk about in this slide is good evidence of consumer culture, the way in which consumer goods affect something that we might imagine as abstract and natural, the rhythms of the clock, the rhythms of the seasons, the rhythms of our lifespan, how consumerism affected that sense of time, very, very demonstrative of what we mean by consumer culture, the way in which consumer goods affect our identity, our meanings, our sense of self. And certainly in the 1920s, consumerism changed our sense of time. It changed our sense of what you might imagine, again, is beyond the reach of consumerism, thanks to the way in which we rarely have a fully developed consumer culture in this period. One example of this was the way in which Alfred P. Sloan, the head of Ford's great rival, General Motors, came up with a scheme, a buying scheme, that was designed to envision the span of one's adult life connected to the car you drive and GM products. Alfred P. Sloan was the head of General Motors in the 1920s, and he wanted you to be a GM buyer for life. And so he came up with a scheme over the various brands, the various car makers that were under the umbrella of General Motors, came up with a scheme that you would walk through life by graduating across the various brands of General Motors. The idea was when you're a young person, you're in your 20s, you're just starting out, you buy a Chevy because Chevrolet was the cheapest priced of the GM products. It was the entry-level brand. Then, by your 30s and 40s, you get a raise, you get a promotion, you get married, and you have kids. You need a bigger car, and you can afford a bigger car, so you graduate up to a Buick or Oldsmobile, which was sort of the mid-priced in this tier of brands. Then finally, later in life, when you've achieved a great deal, you're ready to retire and live the good life, you buy a Cadillac, which was the highest priced luxury model of the GM brands. So Sloan came up with this idea that you graduate through the GM product line from Chevrolet to Buick to Cadillac. And what this meant was you could envision your life and where you were in your lifespan in relation to the car you drive. This is very demonstrative of consumer culture. You are what you drive. Now, of course, Sloan did this because he wanted you to be a GM buyer for life. He wanted you to go through this process of going from a Chevrolet to a Buick to an Oldsmobile to eventually a Cadillac. So it's genius, right? He wants you to be a GM buyer for life, from adulthood to your grave, basically, as you go off to the great autotopia in the sky. So it makes sense from a corporate profit motive sensibility, but this really influenced Americans to see their stage in life, their stage in this span of time, one's lifespan, in relation to the car you drive. The car revealed who you are. The car is who you are. As a young person, you drive a Chevrolet, a fun, affordable car. Then you're a serious middle-aged person with a Buick, and then you're living the good life, coasting along in a Cadillac. So this is very demonstrative of how marketing, advertising for these GM products was a way of Americans imagining time, the lifespan, the time of their progress in life related to the cars they drive. Gillette had an advertising campaign in the 1920s that seemed to indicate that if you buy their products, well, you're in charge of time, that you have command over time, that you have command over, again, something you don't have command over, the forward march of time. Their slogan was, "Be master of your time, shave in just 3 minutes." It might seem hokey and silly to us, but this ultimately becomes a mainstay of marketing, something we can again see today in the 21st century. Look how often consumer goods are marketed to you as time-saving devices, that if you just buy this product, you'll have so much more time, right? And we know that's not true. Usually, many of the products we buy don't free us, don't liberate us. Many of the products we buy actually suck a great deal of our time away from us. Think about computers and now smartphones. When computers were first marketed in the 1980s, they were marketed as time-saving devices, that they will allow you to do your family budget and little Timmy's homework so much more efficiently, quicker, so there'll be more time for family fun. We know that's not how it played out. Instead, we find ourselves in many ways slaves to the computers rather than masters of time. But that is a very common way in which consumer goods are marketed through the 20th and now 21st century. And you could see this here in the 1920s with this campaign of Gillette razors, that if you have their razor, you can shave in just 3 minutes. Oh my goodness, imagine what you will do with all that extra time. And this becomes commonplace in the 1920s and remains a marketing technique to this day because it works. We all like to imagine that if we just buy this product, if we just have this consumer good, well, we'll have more time than the guy next to you. We'll have greater opportunities as a result. What Gillette was selling here wasn't razors. They're selling time, the illusion that if you buy the razor, you could somehow have greater control over something that marches on beyond your control, the forward march of time. Another example of how consumer goods 1920s sold time, sold this illusion of greater command and control over time, the way in which beauty products geared towards women offered all sorts of often bogus claims about rolling back the ravages of time, rolling back the effects of aging. If you just buy this beauty cream, it will wipe away wrinkles. If you just buy this product, it will slim you down and make you seem more fit, younger. Again, we see this to this day. So many consumer goods are marketed as ways to combat aging, to give you power over, again, nature. We know it's nonsense, but we fall for it because it proves to be such an effective and alluring message. And in the 1920s, you had these beauty products marketed in this fashion to American women, convincing them if they just buy this product, they'll be younger, more beautiful, more attractive. And therefore, what's being sold here are these cultural meanings associated with identity. So many of the new gadgets and gizmos that became part of American life and American homes in the 1920s were sold as labor-saving devices, appliances, vacuum cleaners, a GE refrigerator was marketed to American consumers with the slogan, "Make entertaining a simple, joyous job." So again, buying this product frees you, liberates you, and the time that you spend using it isn't drudgery and labor. It's fun, it's pleasure. A lot of appliances are still marketed in this way, that if you just have this washing machine, you'll get your laundry done in a matter of seconds and it'll be fun. If you've ever cooked a meal for a crowd, if you've ever hosted a dinner, it's not fun. It's hard work. It's labor. But the marketing of these appliances, whether it's the 1920s or now the 2020s, involves telling you that no, it'll be fun. It will be joyous. It won't be laborious because you have this GE product. So a lot of consumer goods were sold in this way as liberating, emancipatory, that they grant you more time or they make the time you spend using them fun and pleasurable. Good examples here again about how Americans came to think about themselves and their relationship to time through consumerism. One last example of how the consumer culture of the 1920s changed our sense of time. So many Americans bought the automobiles, the appliances, the phonographs, the radios in this period on time. That was a phrase that became very common in the 1920s, meaning they bought them by borrowing. They bought them by putting down a small down payment and then paying it off over time. The expansion of consumer credit. Many department stores, 1920s, established their own in-house credit bureaus. We didn't have credit cards yet. They won't appear until the 1950s, but there were expanded consumer credit opportunities in this period where department stores had their own in-house credit system. So you could buy the living room set today, take it home, and then pay it off over time. You could have the pleasure right now of owning this, and you could postpone over time the pain of paying for it. Many of the automobile companies in this period opened up their own finance operations. Ford, GM, now Toyota, Honda, they don't make money by selling cars. They make money by selling money. The main profit centers for automobile manufacturers today aren't the sale directly of automobiles. Instead, it's the sale of loans. If you buy a car today, you might finance through Ford Motor Credit, through GMAC, through the banks that these automobile manufacturers own. And that's really their source of money. That's their source of profit, selling you money that you borrow and then pay off with interest. And that first began in the 1920s, so that you could buy that car right now, drive it off the lot, and with it, they had a changing sense of time. You could have immediate pleasure. You could have immediate satisfaction, and again, postpone the pain over time. Really, 1920s, American attitudes towards debt were beginning to change thanks to this and the pleasure that came with owning now and postponing pain. In the 19th century, in the 1800s, debt was considered a moral failing. In the 1800s, if you were in debt, it came with a moral judgment that somehow you were wrong, that you were sinful, that you were licentious. In the 20th century, debt changes, and it loses that moral stigma, that moral judgment. In fact, today, debt is often seen as admirable because it's associated with things like home ownership, college educations. If you're not in debt today, people say, well, there's something wrong with you. In the 1800s, if you were in debt, people saw that as a moral failing, saw that as something being wrong with you. You're a bad person because you have debt. In the 20th, and certainly now by the 21st century, American attitudes about debt change. And that began with the expanded consumer credit in the 1920s. That's another way in which we thought differently about time in this period. So many of the gadgets, gizmos, pleasures, icons of consumerism in the 1920s that seemed to define the good life in this era of an expanded consumer culture were bought on time. 75% of cars, 75% of radios, 80% of appliances. Americans saw through consumer goods pleasure, comfort, the good life, and with it, in accessing these consumer goods, you had these changes in our sense of time, whether it was in the way in which consumer products seemed to liberate you, free you up, somehow eke out 25 hours in a day, the way in which these consumer goods were marketed as exerting power over time by rolling back the effects of aging, or the way in which consumerism and the expanded consumer credit this period seem to give you pleasure now and postpone over time the pain of paying for those consumer goods, changing our sense in a direction towards a more instant gratification culture. So consumerism, one effect of consumerism, one good example of consumer culture, the way in which consumer goods changed our sense of time in the 1920s. And they changed our sense of physical space. And you could certainly see that in changes that occurred in the 1920s in regards to the home. With the expanded consumer credit in this period, people could also get low down payment, low interest loans to buy homes. With the automobile, you had the first wave of suburbanization in the 1920s, where new housing developments were being built in a construction boom, ringing outward from urban centers, luring people away from downtown to the suburbs for the first time. We often associate the post-World War II period of the late 40s and the 50s as the heyday of suburbanization, but really the first great wave of suburbanization took place in the 1920s because of all of these trends we've now enunciated. The automobile, the booming economy, the expanded consumer credit. As you could see here, you could buy a complete house out of a catalog for a few $1,000s in the 1920s. And this, again, was increasingly accessible by more and more Americans, not just the rich. Prior to the 1920s, homeownership was, like a lot of experiences in America, the province of a few, the province of the rich. Before the 1920s, most Americans were renters. But with the expanded consumer credit, with this wave of suburbanization, with a booming economy, even immigrant families, working class families could now afford a cheap house built in the suburbs here in the 1920s. giving them a sense of the good life, now defined by this consumer good, the suburban home, giving people an increasing sense of private space as they were no longer in large tenement buildings, apartment buildings. In urban areas, they had their own private space, their own private Idaho. In the suburbs, ringing outward from the urban cores. And Southern California was then a heyday of suburbanization. Many new housing developments sprang up here in Southern California in the 1920s, including one beckoning people out of downtown LA to the Hollywood Hills, known as Hollywood Land. The Hollywood sign, that is such an icon now, such a symbol of Los Angeles, Southern California, that may today be associated with the glitz and glamour of the film industry. We tend to associate the Hollywood sign with that idea of Hollywood, but originally it read Hollywood Land, and it was put up there in the then suburbs of Los Angeles as a marketing gimmick to draw people's attention away from downtown LA to a new housing development known as Hollywood Land there in the Hollywood Hills. Last four letters of Hollywood Land would eventually deteriorate, and the sign would later be preserved solely stating Hollywood and then become associated with glitz, glamour, that image of Hollywood. But originally it was a real estate sign offering a good life there in the suburbs of the Hollywood Hills. Only in Los Angeles could we turn a real estate sign into a civic treasure. How Los Angeles, right? But that sign, originally erected in the 1920s as a marketing gimmick for the suburbs, demonstrates how here in Southern California this new way of living was beginning to develop. A new way of living that again changed our sense of the physical space, changed our sense of our physical surroundings, much like, as we talked about on the previous slide, consumerism was changing our sense of time. What suburbanization did, what the greater accessibility of the private suburban home did, was give us a greater sense of privacy, exclusivity, and individuality. These are all cultural values associated with this consumer good. So again, we're talking about consumer culture, the identities, meanings associated with now the suburban home. You didn't live in a big apartment building in an urban area. You had your own private space, giving people a greater sense of privacy. With this came a greater informality to life because your home was very exclusive. It wasn't really open to the public. It was very common in homes of the late 19th century to include a parlor as part of the layout of the home. And a parlor was sort of a semi-private space where you might bring in to your home a traveling salesman who wanted to show you the latest brush he had for sale. Or it might be where you would entertain the elementary school teacher who wanted to come over and talk about little Timmy or little Sally's grades. A parlor seems very outmoded, old-fashioned to us. Chances are whatever home you live in today or grew up in, there wasn't a parlor. But it was very common in Victorian homes of the 1800s. Here in the 1920s, the parlor disappears and it's replaced by the living room, a place that was casual, private, cut off from the public. And so homes in the 1920s increasingly were associated with privacy and as well individuality because this was your own home. You could decorate it as you like. Many of the homes, like you see here, were bought out of a catalog. They were cookie cutter. They were so similar to your neighbor's home. And so you wanted to customize the home to reflect your true self, your individuality. So you might put in a garden. You might put in a backyard barbecue or a deck, allowing you to customize your home, make it different than the home next door, making it less cookie cutter and uniform, and in doing so allow you to express your individuality. So these are all values that came with the more privatized, exclusive space of the suburban home of the 1920s. It's very common prior to the 1920s for, again, most Americans to rent rather than buy, and also for those who did own homes to have live-in boarders. Boarders were strangers inside your house who helped pay the rent or the mortgage. They were sometimes unmarried men who might be coming into town looking for work, drifters of sorts, who might work in a more seasonal, fluctual labor market, only be there for a few months, and so they lived as boarders inside the home. You might rent out a room to a college student during the time in which classes are in session during an academic year. Very common in middle class and working class homes to have a live-in boarder, meaning there's someone living inside your house who was not related to you, who was there to help pay the rent or the mortgage. Very commonplace before the 1920s and the expanded consumer credit and the cheap cookie-cutter homes that were now available. But in the 1920s, with the greater accessibility of these privatized spaces, the live-in boarder is eliminated, and that meant that everyone inside your house was a member of your family, where you had that sense of familiarity. There were no strangers in your house, no boarders in your house, and that too changed our sense of our physical surroundings, changed our sense of our physical space, because again, it lent the home a sense of exclusivity, privacy, no strangers in your home, a sense that this was the privatized space of the people in this home. Another example of how the suburban home changed our sense of space was the way in which, again, it allowed physical space inside our homes to be a domain of expression, of individuality. I mentioned earlier that people who bought these homes often wanted to customize the homes, decorate the homes, or put on additions like a deck or a backyard barbecue as a way of expressing oneself. This is how we came to think of the home as, like the car, as we talked about earlier, a marker of identity, as an expression of self. You know who you are based on your house and what it says about you, or the way in which you've changed and manipulated your house to reflect yourself. Also, in that vein, the way in which newlyweds who had bought these homes and were starting their lives anew in the 1920s would buy furniture and appliances for their home that reflected their own tastes and personalities. This again was a product of expanded consumer credit, a booming economy. You might buy appliances, those markers of the good life, furniture on time, on credit, and in doing so, decorate your house. So not only did you have a home of your own, but you weren't decorating that house with hand-me-downs that you got from your parents. You were starting your new life as newlyweds with your own appliances, furniture that reflected your own tastes and individuality. The home became a place of one's expression, one's identity, one's individuality. Today we often take this for granted. The way the car says who you are, reflects your personality, identity, and the way in which our homes are decorated in a way that reveals who we are. This is the whole industry surrounding home improvement, Home Depot, Lowe's. This is the whole cult of domesticity that prevails today, that encourages us to see our homes as extensions of ourselves, and certainly that's been amplified in this current epidemic where we find so much of ourselves spending time at home. One of the booming industries right now during the flagging economy that's come with COVID is home improvement. And a lot of people are spending more time at home and seeing their homes increasingly so as extensions of themselves. And that really began here in the 1920s. So not only were we changing our sense of time, we also were changing our sense of space, the physical space that surrounded us, in these changes that came with expanded home ownership and suburbanization. All right, so in the previous slides, we've talked about how the expanded consumer economy of the 1920s affected people's sense of time, people's sense of physical space, as windows into the consumer culture of the 1920s. Let's now talk about how consumerism in the 1920s changed our sense of gender and the meanings and ideologies associated with male, female. When we talk about gender, we're talking about cultural ideas associated with maleness, femaleness, femininity, masculinity. So gender is inherently culture. It speaks cultural. It speaks to the ideas, the associations, the meanings that we associate with the sexes. And in the 1920s, consumerism became a key force in establishing certain gender ideologies, particularly in regards to American women. And that's because the first 2 decades of the 20th century leading up to the 1920s, the progressive era, was a time in which new attitudes and new ideas about womanhood developed. In the early 20th century, in the progressive era, There was a new archetype, a new image of American womanhood that developed known as the New Woman. The New Woman ideal was the idea that women should be involved in public and political life. It was a rejection of Victorian sensibilities that may have prevailed in the late 19th century that urged women to accept a domestic and non-public, non-political role. In the early 20th century, young feminists challenged that with the New Woman ideal. A new woman for the new century. It was the early 1900s. It was the dawn of the 20th century. And the New Woman ideal was one that embraced women involved in public and political life. Women in this period were very vital to the progressive reform efforts. They were campaigning for child labor laws. They were campaigning for the temperance movement that would seek to prohibit alcohol. They were on both sides of the debate regarding World War I. Some women were active in the peace movement, trying to prevent America's entrance into the war. Other women were active in building support for the war, leading blood drives and scrap drives and planting victory gardens. So in this period, in the progressive era, in the decades prior to the 1920s, women were very active in public and political life, and the capper to this was the 19th Amendment, when in 1920, this amendment was added to the Constitution that granted women the right to vote in all federal elections. So there was a new archetype that was developing in the progressive era that embraced women involved in public and political life. Women were increasingly active in a variety of social and political causes. And many feminists hoped to continue that effort into the 1920s to build on the successes that came with the 19th Amendment and further the cause of female liberation, feminism, and the political and cultural emancipation of women. Many feminists hoped that the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, that was designed to grant women the right to vote, but effectively meant only white women could vote, as racial minorities continued to face all sorts of efforts to prevent them from voting. Many feminists hope to build on that and continue a political cause and political agenda of reform. In the 1920s, feminists advanced the Equal Rights Amendment, which they hoped would be the next amendment to the Constitution that was designed to end all legal limits on women so that women could pursue an education, a career, basically individual autonomy, the same status as men. But those efforts failed because the 1920s was a very conservative and reactionary period. It was often driven by a denunciation, a rejection of the progressive era. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, many Americans felt overwhelmed, fatigued, critical of the progressive era. 1920s was a very conservative and reactionary period, and as a result, a lot of the political efforts that feminists hoped to advance in the 1920s stalled. The Equal Rights Amendment was not adopted, and sadly, tragically, has yet to be adopted even now in the 21st century. And so political liberation, political efforts, true legislative change stalled in the 1920s. And what happens is that the cause of the New Woman, the cause of feminism, instead becomes commodified and sold as an image rather than a lived reality of political change. So the Equal Rights Amendment is not ratified. 1920s would prove to be a very reactionary conservative period that often stymied and limited further gains and political change for the cause of feminism. Instead, feminism becomes a lifestyle, an image that's sold and marketed here in the 1920s. Feminism becomes a cultural image rather than a political reality. And this is something that happens a great deal in American history and American culture. This is American Studies 201. We are in our 4 different time periods cumulatively over the span of the semester examining the totality of American history from the colonial period now to the 21st century. And what you often see when you examine American history and culture in this large-scale way is that things that begin as transgressive, rebellious, challenging to the social order often get co-opted and marketed to Americans. In doing so, their political meanings, their political message often gets removed, defanged, and it becomes something much more acceptable, much more mainstream as it is ultimately marketed to the masses. I like to describe this as the cultural car wash, where something that initially is transgressive, political, eventually gets diluted, washed away of its political meanings, and ultimately marketed and sold to the masses. A couple examples of this: rock and roll. When rock and roll appeared in the 1950s, it was transgressive, it was sexual, it caused a great national freak out about teenage delinquency. But by the early 60s, rock and roll had become sanitized. Elvis Presley is drafted. His long hair is ultimately shorn by army barbers. And rock and roll becomes something really treacle and saccharine, the thing of teen idols like Fabian. It will take the British invasion to make rock and roll dangerous again by the mid to late 60s. Hip-hop, a more contemporary example. In the 80s, again, there was a national freakout about hip-hop and an effort to label the records, a great fear about gangsta rap, and the way in which these songs represented anthems for racial resistance, young African-American men singing critically about the police. And so the 1980s caused a great fear about hip-hop. But today, hip-hop has gone mainstream. Every white Midwesterner teenager has a Tupac poster in their bedroom. Hip-hop is used to sell orange juice and credit cards in marketing. Your grandma has a Beyonce ringtone, right? So what happened to hip-hop? It became less dangerous, less transgressive, and that's just a couple of examples how through American history, consumerism, capitalism, consumer culture often takes something that was once restive and dangerous and turns it into a way to sell stuff. And that's what happened here in the 1920s in regards to the image of the new woman. Something that initially was about feminism, emancipation of women, true political liberation, ultimately was used to sell Coca-Cola automobiles and cigarettes. The flapper image that we often associate with the 1920s of young urban women cutting their hair short, dancing the Lindy Hop in short skirts, was an urban experience lived by many American women in this period. Women who flouted conventions, who drank and smoked openly in public in the era of prohibition of the 1920s when alcohol was banned. That was a real experience, but what happens is that real lived experience of greater expressions of liberation, sexuality. Flappers were very open in their sexuality and expressing a libido in the 1920s when birth control for the first time really became increasingly available. And the first birth control clinics opened in the 1920s, allowing women to pursue the pleasure of sex without concerns about reproduction. That urban experience of women living increasingly free lives, expressing their libido, dancing Lindy Hop at jazz clubs and swooning over matinee idols like Rudolph Valentino, ultimately becomes used to market cigarettes, automobiles, images of the good life that take this once transgressive force of the flapper, the new woman, these young feminists, these young women living a life of their own making, cutting their hair short, dancing Lindy Hop, drinking and smoking in public, and use it for the cause of marketing, advertising to bolster corporate America and the consumer economy. So the flapper, the new woman, these images of American womanhood that again were initially so transgressive simply become devices for consumerism, devices for marketing, devices for advertising, demonstrative of how gender ideologies, that element of identity and culture, get connected to consumerism here in the 1920s. Not only were attitudes about space and time changing, attitudes about gender ultimately are changing in this period through the expanded consumerism, marketing, and advertising 1920s that take these political causes like feminism and the new woman and use them instead to sell the good life, to sell consumer goods. Think about today. Right now, some social political forces that we may see as controversial, transgressive, and it will be interesting to see if they may be the latest iterations of this phenomenon in American history that take these political forces and make them ultimately commodities to be bought and sold. Arguably, we're seeing that right now with things like Black Lives Matter. Look how corporate America has embraced that as a marketing device. Very similar experience here in the 1920s in the cause of feminism. And here are some examples of this to make it a bit more concrete. Here are two ads from the 1920s that take this image of the new woman, the flapper, the feminist, and use it to sell, here in this case, Coca-Cola and cigarettes. On the left, a Coca-Cola ad for the 1970s showing a young woman with her short skirt and short hair, an image of, again, a young feminist woman now being sold, being used to sell and market Coca-Cola. So it's a good example of how that image could be used to ultimately undergird a consumer culture and economy. On the right, an ad for Lucky Strike cigarettes. When cigarettes were marketed in the 1920s to women, it was really the first time where cigarette manufacturers directly marketed to American women. Certainly women had bought cigarettes previously with James Duke and his innovations and the way in which, as we talked about in a previous lecture, cigarettes were mass produced in this period. But up until the 1920s, cigarette manufacturers refused to acknowledge that and directly market to American women. 1920s, that taboo melted away, and Lucky Strike and many other manufacturers of cigarettes for the first time directly marketed their goods to American women. They acknowledged that they too are buying cigarettes. And when they did so, they often again co-opted this image of the new woman. In many of the cigarette ads of the 1920s, cigarettes were referred to, this is the actual phrase used, as torches of freedom. Ladies, when you're smoking a Lucky Strike cigarette, you're not sucking on a cancer stick. No, no, no. That's a torch of freedom. And that really demonstrates how cigarettes were being used to market an ideal of freedom, of liberation. Feminism, the new woman ideal, was all about freedom, the right to vote, the right to pursue a life of one's own making. But now that political cause was being used to market cigarettes, consumer good. You could prove you were a free individual, a free woman, through the cigarettes you smoked. Good example of, again, how consumerism marketed a lifestyle and image. Good example here of consumer culture now in relation to these ideals of female liberation. All right, let's conclude this lecture with one last cultural effect of this expanded consumerism of the 1920s. Certainly, hopefully at this point in the lecture, you've seen how the 1920s represented a period of a booming economy with the way in which America, again, benefited in a global economy from the effects of World War I decimating Europe. This seemed to validate the program of industrial freedom that was advanced by Republican presidents like Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, that if you deregulate the economy, roll back what we're seeing as the excesses of the progressive era, lower taxes on the rich, a rising tide will lift all boats. And so the 1920s is a time of a booming economy where consumer goods that had once been inaccessible, automobiles, homes, were now available to even working class Americans. There was that satisfaction of novelty, new experiences, phonographs. By the 1920s, movies now had sound. So there was this way in which, as a result of these expanded opportunities, new opportunities, this really seemed to indicate that the American way, the good life, was again a product of stuff. Americans enjoyed higher wages as Fordism increasingly became the rule, strikes and labor strife, much less common in the 1920s, as workers were encouraged to see themselves in solidarity with, in league with, their bosses rather than an antagonistic relationship. There were all these ways in which, again, new opportunities seemed to abound. A good life seemed to be at hand. And one last cultural effect of that was a reverence for the businessmen who made this possible. This, too, very much demonstrates how the 1920s represents a reaction to, a rejection of the progressive era. The progressive era was a time where most Americans, influenced by muckraking journalists like Jacob Riis, had come to see big businessmen as greedy, rapacious obstacles to the good life. But in the 1920s, Americans increasingly saw businessmen not as obstacles to the good life, but the handmaidens of the good life, the men who made the gadgets, gizmos that gave you more time, gave you more privacy, gave you freedom and opportunity. So Henry Ford becomes a hero. The biographies of men like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, who were often the villains of the progressive era, became bestsellers and rocketed to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. In 1928, Americans voted a rich businessman president, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was the last of the Republican presidents of the 1920s, and he won in 1928 based on his reputation as a great businessman. Now, I know this will come as a great shock to you that there once was a time in American history that we elected a man president because he bragged of being a rich businessman. Use your historical imagination. Use your imagination to imagine such a strange and different time. So the zenith, in many ways, of this reverence for the businessmen was the fact that by 1928, we were so ready to elect a rich businessman to the highest office in the land. Another example of the way in which Americans came to worship big business, worship businessmen, was the way in which Americans in the 1920s often associated an abstract cultural value of beauty in relation to the cars, the consumer goods produced in this period. You had the Art Deco movement that turned skyscrapers into these gleaming icons of modernity and the good life and beauty. The Chrysler Building becomes the standard bearer of the skyscraper of the 1920s, and it bears the name of a major corporation producing automobiles. You read in the Bo Brow Strain book about sliced bread, how this was seen as a miracle, a great advance, how sliced bread remains a metaphor to this day for innovation and good life, the best thing since sliced bread. And part of the appeal of sliced bread was the uniform slices. They were so symmetrical and uniform and therefore beautiful. Automobiles were garish and overflowing with chrome and shine and all kinds of hood ornaments and other physical expressions of beauty. So Americans in the 1920s came to see businessmen and the gadgets they produced as emblems of beauty, the good life, progress, modernity. And the best evidence I have for you of this is the best-selling book published in 1925, The Man Nobody Knows, penned by Bruce Barton. This is perhaps the best evidence I have for you here of this cultural effect of consumerism in the 1920s, the way in which, through all the forces and developments we've now talked about in this lecture, Americans came to worship the businessman, the man who produced all the gadgets, gizmos, that provided a source of meaning for Americans who were craving normalcy, regularity, and the good life after, again, the tumults and changes of the progressive era and the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Subtitle of this book, The Man Nobody Knows, which would go on to be a huge bestseller, and still stands as one of the best-selling nonfiction books of the 20th century. Subtitle of this book was The Real Jesus Christ. Who's the man nobody knows? Well, Barton argues in this book, priests, ministers, they need to be careful because most of them don't know the real Jesus Christ. They stand up there on Sunday morning and preach about Jesus as a man who walked among the poor, washed the feet of slaves. According to Barton, that's not the real Jesus Christ. He argues in this book that Jesus Christ should be best understood as a businessman. He said, how else do you explain how one guy took 12 fishermen and created a business that conquered the world? Barton argues Christianity is not a religion, it's the greatest marketing scheme in human history. Jesus Christ knew how to sell an idea. He argues in this book, if Jesus was alive in 1925, he wouldn't be working at a soup kitchen, feeding the poor, or reading to the illiterate. He would be CEO of the world's largest advertising agency. Barton argues Jesus knew how to sell. He was a businessman. In the 1920s, Americans were encouraged to see businessmen as gods. They produced the gadgets, gizmos, and wonders that provided meaning, granted you a sense of power over time and space here in the 1920s. Well, Bruce Barton said, God is a businessman. If you think this is strange and bizarre, this book was a huge bestseller. It went on to be one of the best-selling nonfiction books of the 20th century. Well, think about our America today. Do we continue to see businessmen as gods? Yeah. Do we worship the rich? Certainly. Think about reality TV, what we call reality TV, Kardashians, Real Housewives. We spend our leisure time watching people be rich. That seems to be entertainment in America. Think about shows like Dancing with the Idiots and America's Got Herpes, all these shows you guys are into today, where someone is plucked out of obscurity and given fame and fortune. We make today biopics about Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs. After Steve Jobs died, a best-selling biography of him skyrocketed to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. When he died, people were crying. When Steve Jobs died, there were candlelit vigils, people weeping in the streets. Why? Because a rich businessman died who provided all the gadgets and gizmos that make your life meaningful. The iPad, the iPhone. So, though this might seem bizarre to us, it's not too removed from the way in which we still, in many ways, continue to worship businessmen, consumerism. Bruce Barton in 1925 penned this book. It became a huge bestseller, and it is perhaps the best evidence of the consumer culture of the 1920s I can offer to you here as we conclude this lecture. He argued that Jesus Christ was a businessman in an age where Americans came to see businessmen as gods. He urged you to see God as a businessman. However, at the end of the 1920s, the stock market will crash and the country will descend into the greatest economic disaster, at least for now, in our history, the Great Depression. And that changes everything. It ushers in another age of reform, the New Deal era, where the federal government once again will come in a much more interventionist role, create programs like Social Security, public housing, welfare, to provide a safety net, a minimum standard of living for Americans. Also, as a result, attitudes about business will shift. And in the 1930s, Americans often blame big business, its greed, its avarice for the misery Americans felt in the Great Depression of the 1930s. So there's certainly an ebb and flow in modern American history in regards to enthusiasm for capitalism, consumerism, and big business. 1920s saw American sensibilities certainly cleave in that direction, as we've demonstrated here, but at the end of the decade, the stock market crashes, country descends into the greatest economic disaster in our nation's history, and attitudes will change accordingly. But in this lecture, we've certainly testified, hopefully, to the way in which in that decade before the crash, the 1920s was an age where Americans came to understand who they are, what they value, what is beautiful, what is true in regards to stuff.